The Consulting Success podcast is powered by the Clarity Coaching Program. If you'd like to work directly with the Consulting Success team and receive personal coaching and support to optimize and grow your consulting business, marketing, and revenue, visit consultingsuccess.com to find out more and apply.
Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Zapersky. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the world of elite consultants, where you'll learn the strategies, tactics, and mindset to grow a highly profitable and successful consulting business.
Hey everyone, it's Michael Zapersky, and welcome back to another episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. Today, I am very excited to have Martin Reeves joining us. Martin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Martin, you've been with the Boston Consulting Group, also known as BCG, for 30 plus years. You're also the chair of the BCG Henderson Institute, which is a think tank dedicated to exploring and developing valuable insights. You're a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review, MIT SMR, Fortune, and other publications. And then your most recent book is called The Imagination Machine: How to Spark New Ideas and Create Your Company's Future. And I thought where we could start off today is going back a little bit into your past, because you spent, as I mentioned, 30 plus years in the world of consulting. But one thing that really got my attention right away is that you spent a bunch of that time not in one place. So you've been in countries like Japan, Russia, India, the UK, and the US, where you are today. And I'm wondering what stands out to you as maybe some of the big differences or similarities that when you think about kind of professional services and the work that you did as a consultant, what kind of sticks with you today from the experience of working in all these different places around the world?
First, the commonalities. I joined BCG because of a very romantic notion to me, which is the idea that it's possible to change the world through ideas. I've always thought about ideas as being the ultimate technology. A few millivolts in the right part of your brain at the right time enables you to change how you think, change how you communicate, change how others think, and change the world. And so that was the sort of romantic notion that propelled me into consulting. And that's been true of Japan, London, Eastern Europe, East Coast, West Coast of the US, various other places. Not saying it's easy, but that dream has always been, I think, a very motivating and applicable one for myself and also for clients. Now, the differences, at a superficial level, I actually didn't see a lot of differences in the different places that I worked. Pretty much the same sorts of clients with the same sorts of problems. I think at a deeper level, culture starts to influence things. So I remember being rather disappointed when I first went to Japan that things were not more different. But my first offsite showed actually that at a deeper level, things were very different. So I remember one of the things we did in Japan was something called a Gasshoku project, which essentially means offsite. And the idea was you take a crisis, a simulated crisis, and you put executives through it. And they become extremely emotional, extremely engaged. And it's almost like a psychological test, essentially. It's a test of emotional propensities as much as logical ones. So that was rather different. The sort of baptism of fire school of management training in Japan. So every place I've been has one of those.
Is there anything that, and I'm just selfishly asking just because I always enjoy travel and learning about different people and cultures and religions and all that kind of stuff, but is there anything that stands out for you in terms of maybe you had to walk on eggshells, or just something you have to be very careful of, or just something that really sticks with you to this day as, wow, that would be a real faux pas?
I remember I studied physiology in Japanese, so I had a certain level of proficiency in Japanese, but consulting in Japanese is an entirely different thing. I'd been in BCG Japan for a while, and I was leading finally, after much apprenticeship, I was leading a Japanese assignment for a very Japanese client, having written the slides in Japanese, and I was presenting in Japanese. And before I went into the room, the partner for the project leafed through the deck and he pulled out the last page, which was the conclusion slide, which I found rather mystifying, but I went with it. And so we had this presentation, and these people were from Osaka, the client. So I spoke standard Tokyo Japanese, or at least a foreigner's version of that. So there was some cultural mismatch, which probably even a Tokyoite would feel between Tokyo and Osaka. But anyway, we got through that. And at the end of the presentation, the CEO said, "That was remarkable for a foreigner, Mr. Reeves. We could understand exactly what you're saying. It made sense. It was very insightful. I think you created a great contribution. But if I may just point out one thing, you didn't press through to the logical implication of your analysis, which is that we should exit this business." And inside, I was fuming because this was the very slide that the partner had pulled from the deck. After the meeting, I remember accosting the partner and saying, "This is why I didn't want you to remove the last slide from the deck." And he said, "Oh, no. An eagle never shows its claws." The client's thinking that you're a little bit silly and not having reached the conclusion, and instead self-discovering their own conclusion is far better than you looking clever for having the conclusion. And this was a huge cultural lesson that initially I thought was very specific to Japan, but actually, of course, this logic of self-discovery turns out to be a consulting universal. So many moments like that.
And did that actually play out, that looking back, do you feel that was the right move of letting the client reach their own conclusion in that scenario?
I think with consultants trying to solve problems, and there's always the anxiety of, can I solve this particular problem? And am I credible to solve it? And so in a sense, we want the answer. But I think we all realize, or at least the veterans realize, that an even better answer is for the client to reach the answer, because they'll then own the answer. And of course, what you really want to do is to create impact, not merely impart a solution that may or may not be owned by the client.
A common question that kind of comes up in the world of consulting is around the advantage versus disadvantage of cross-industry experience. So some view being very narrow and deep as an advantage, and others view having experience with many different industries as a real advantage. How do you view this, and what's your belief around that?
That's very specific to me in my career in a way, that in the sense that BCG started off as a generalist consulting firm. The idea was that we practice strategy, and strategy, competitive advantage, was a way of looking at any situation even more insightfully than knowing the specifics of a situation, because essentially you are abstracting the most important question, which is the competitive advantage in what I'm doing. I think the consulting world shifted and everybody put in practice groups, I think, roughly speaking, during the 1980s. And things began to be very specialized. And the world was such that it was hard, at least in the big firm consulting that I did, it was hard to be hired unless you had industry expertise in a certain area. And then more recently, a little bit, not a full swing in the opposite direction, which is clients saying, look, now we know this industry inside out. That's actually a problem. Your industry-specific team has the same knowledge. That's sort of part of the problem. So could you bring us somebody that knows nothing about us and something about other industries, please? So they're starting to ask for that. I'm detecting a sort of a pull for that generalist perspective again. So I think it's a pendulum that slowly swings back and forth. But for me, I've always thought about myself as a specialist in problem solving, i.e. a generalist, or almost agnostic with respect to the industry. And so for me, the most fear was always inspired by cases where I may have the illusion that I knew something about the industry, because essentially I would be asserting based on expert knowledge rather than looking at the facts of the competitive situation and the logic of competition. And I've always been able to find a path as a generalist. Sometimes I found myself feeling a little bit out in the wilderness in a minority of a generalist in a specialist world. And nowadays I start to feel like more of the mainstream again, but I'm an unashamed generalist.
So you mentioned this, the pendulum is swinging back in the direction now of people being more open, actually seeking out those that have experience across industries or might consider themselves to be a bit more on the generalist side. What do you think is the cause for that swing of going towards specialization now, slowly maybe coming back towards the direction of a more generalist approach?
I think it's probably the disruption of historical mechanisms of success and also the blurring of industry boundaries. I'm not sure whether you'd agree, but I find that few industries nowadays think about themselves as industries. So something was always very convenient for consultants was that the unit of analysis was the industry or the market, and the key statistic was the market share or the relative market share. Of course, if you have blurred boundaries, if it's not clear what the entertainment industry actually means, and it's a zoo of telecoms companies, film companies, digital platform companies, and all sorts of other things, you can't be so simplistic. You have to look at the whole circumstances. And I think the rise of digital ecosystems, platform businesses don't respect boundaries. And then the rise of digital disruption, which essentially says whatever you thought your success model is probably prone to disruption, or you might be hiring us because it's already been disrupted. In which case, what you need is new thinking, iconoclastic thinking, industry agnostic thinking, analogical thinking from other industries, as opposed to knowing exactly how it's always worked in the agrochemicals industry and being slightly better at it.
Is there a benefit or maybe a difference in how a consultant might think about their positioning, and should they try to have a position that is more around being a generalist versus specialist based on the stage of where they're at in their consulting career? And so what I mean by that is there a benefit to an earlier stage consultant to really focus on, let's say, specialization, and as they actually accumulate more experience, they become more of a generalist, or perhaps the other way around? How do you view that in terms of the stage of someone's career?
I think probably the most common path, as far as I can tell, at least in BCG, is you start off by accumulating a certain generality of experience. You may work in a variety of industries, and you're essentially learning the basics. And then 2 years in, you identify with a practice group and you become an expert in a particular industry. I think has been the most common path and probably will continue to be a viable path. But I think there's space, more and more space. There always was space historically. When strategy consulting was founded in the early 60s on the East Coast of America, it was a generalist profession. The strategist was not specific to a particular industry. He was an expert in the logic competition. I think we're seeing, again, more and more opportunities for generalists. I think a related phenomenon is the edge in the consulting skill set. It's not exactly the same thing, but in a sense, consultants are always distinguished by having a more accelerated experience than an industry expert. An industry expert may know everything about their company and their segment, but they won't have done a restructuring project in times. There's something to do with breadth, which is they'll have done it at least in several parts of the industry, if not other industries. Something to do with the skills of problem solving and communication, pyramid principle communication. I think it's also a time in the history of consulting where we must ask ourselves what distinguishes the consulting skill set, because in a sense, we're often hired for our difference, the skills that we have that our clients may not have. And I think that's shifting. I think PowerPoint and pyramid principle and communication skills, I think most executives have that now. I think the MBA education, the broad education of how all of the different functions of business work. I think more clients have that nowadays. So what's the edge? I think problem solving is still an edge. I think problem solving is a deep art. And I think if you're constantly solving problems day in, day out, as opposed to refining the current recipe, I think that's a skill set that the consultants still have. I think this sort of analogical thinking across industries becomes increasingly important. And I think in an age where simplistic analysis is no longer very differentiated because we can have artificial intelligence do that, or we can have advanced analytics doing that. I think the focus on the uniquely human elements of business, the less mechanical aspects of analysis. So my list would be anything to do with empathy, purpose, ethics, or creativity. I think they are played up relative to the traditional analytical toolkit.
You spoke about the logic of competition and the connection to strategy, and I want to come to that in just a moment. But I think what you mentioned right now, I found quite fascinating around this whole idea of problem solving. And if you can become a master problem solver, that creates a lot of value for your business and for clients as well. For someone who wants to become a better problem solver, are there certain mental models or exercises, or how can someone start to work towards becoming a better problem solver?
I think like any tool, essentially I'm going to answer your question, but the things I'm going to say are simplistic. And like any tool, a tool is a discrete point on a landscape, but actually the reality is a continuum. You create new tools, you blend tools to create the right tools for the purpose. But in terms of the first steps of improving problem solving, I think there is the skill of some of the basics. One of them would be the skill of abstraction or drilling down. The two questions I find myself asking all of the time since the beginning of my career, and I still ask them, I used to have them pinned to my computer when I had a PC. One is, what is that an example of, which is the generalization question or the abstraction question. Another one is, what is an example of that, which is the concretization level switch. And because sometimes you need to go down into the weeds to see the details or to explain something vividly to somebody. But a lot of the times as consultants, we need to abstract. We need to say, what is this an example of? I think framing and reframing is incredibly important. So here's an extreme statement. Maybe this is controversial to your listeners, maybe not. But I have never seen a single case in my career, not one I can remember anyway, where the client's specification of the problem was the actual problem. It was the client's best attempt to frame the problem, but almost by definition, they were begging a superior framing of the question. So I think another basic for improving one's skills as a problem solver is not to immediately jump into solutioning, if that's a word, but rather to say, what is the problem? What is the right question in this situation? And to do that, then you have to ask a whole bunch of other questions like, what do we know? What are we assuming we know, but we don't actually know? Essentially, what's a fact? What are some alternative ways of viewing this situation? Do we discover anything interesting or new if we look at this through different lenses? So often in strategy, I look at things through 5 lenses, which was the topic of my last book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. I look at things as a planning problem. What should we plan to do in this situation? I look at things as an adapting problem. What should we be learning in this situation? I look at things as a visioning problem. What could we create in this situation? I look at things as an exercise in collaboration, which is how could we collaborate with others to get to a solution in this particular situation? And I look at a rejuvenation lens, which is what is broken that needs fixing in order to get to a solution in this particular situation. I generally try on all of those lenses. Each of them gives different insights. And then I select my framing as being the most useful one, the most pragmatic one in the circumstances. But another sort of inevitability, I think, in consulting is you're playing at the edges and the gaps. Rarely are you able to add more than incremental value precisely by using the framing of the client. Essentially, that's we're pretty good, but could you make us slightly better without changing any assumption sort of situation, which can be valuable, but it's rarely absurdly valuable. Typically in looking at things in a different way to the clients or reframing or looking between the edges to well-established ways of looking at something.
The word strategy is thrown around a lot. I think many people misunderstand it. And so I know that you've spent a lot of time thinking about strategy, working with organizations and helping them with their strategy. Your latest view and definition of strategy. And I'm also wondering, Martin, has your kind of view or beliefs around strategy and the role it plays and what makes it effective changed over the years?
So I think it's a good question because the role of strategy has become a little controversial. We're seeing books like The End of Competitive Advantage by Rita McGrath, or books like Execution by Velocity, or books on technology, essentially asserting that there's something more important than strategy. And I think this is where we need to define what we mean by strategy. Do we mean something as narrow as planning or something more general? So for me, strategy has always been some systematic pattern of thought or action which produces superior competitive outcomes. And it's deliberately broad and deliberately pragmatic because we're in an applied profession. There is no absolute truth seeking in the world of strategy. There is getting the job done. The strategy exists for a reason, which is to produce superior competitive outcomes. So anything which achieves that, I think we can call strategy. The reason I wrote the book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, a few years ago was essentially it was a summary and a culmination of all of my learnings about the different types of answers to that question. And as I just referred to, as a function of the unpredictability of a situation, the malleability, the shapeability of a situation, and the degree of distress in a situation, you can frame a strategy problem as a planning problem, which is historically how many strategy problems have been framed, or you can frame it as a learning under uncertainty problem. Am I learning faster than my competitors? Or you can frame it as am I creating something new and valuable in the world, an entrepreneurial lens? Or you can frame it as, am I collaborating with others to reframe an industry using a digital ecosystem? Or you can frame it as, is something broken? Do I need to urgently fix it in order to avoid a threat to viability? Those 5 species of strategy that I just mentioned all involve a very different logic, very different analyses, very different skills, and all of them are strategy. The key question in this particular case then becomes the question how to diagnose the right strategy lens for the right situation and the right circumstances. So it's not just that the strategy is different according to the circumstances, the strategy paradigm is different according to the circumstances. And then I think that goes along with one other huge change that I tried to document in the book, which is we used to be commissioned to solve pure strategy problems. I am number 3 market share player. I want to become number 1. The leader's doing this and the number 2 player's doing that. What is my best strategy? It's a pure strategy problem. It doesn't deal with organization. It doesn't deal with execution. Well, personally, I haven't seen a pure strategy problem for at least 15 years. Strategy always comes nowadays, at least in my experience, associated with questions of organization, questions of technology, and increasingly questions politics about sentiments or values or politics. And you have to look at the whole thing. I had to invent a word for what do you call the output of the strategy process to emphasize that. So I call it the strategy stack by analogy with the software stack. Now, the output to a consulting assignment ostensibly on strategy is the right way of thinking about the problem, the moves that you need to make, the skills that are required, the IT infrastructure that's required, the collaborative platforms that others are required, and also the communication and political strategies that may be necessary to embed that strategy in a turbulent environment. I sense the pure discipline of strategy may have ceased to exist about 15 years ago. Nevertheless, I still call myself a strategist because I believe that this framing the right problem and addressing it with the right strategy paradigm is still at the heart of many business problems.
I really like, Martin, how you frame these things up and come up with these ideas and break down the 5 different types of strategy. I'm wondering, how do you come up with your own ideas? How do you decide which ideas are actually worth moving forward with and which are maybe ideas that should only be in that moment, but not actually carried on and you're not investing more time and energy into working through them and developing them?
So nowadays, I'm not primarily a client consultant. I did that for a long period of time. Now I'm primarily in the business of thought leadership, which is creating the ideas and constructs and tools which you will need for tomorrow's problems, for the emerging problems or the new problems, or the not yet fully described or systematized problems. And so indeed, I'm in the business of figuring out what idea to research, what idea to write about. I guess there are a number of components to that. One of them is exposure to novelty. If I expose myself to exactly the same sources of inspiration as the clients that I'm trying to help, it's unlikely that I'll have anything new to say. So for instance, I go much broader on the disciplines that I draw upon. So I spend relatively little time reading business literature and quite a lot of time reading physics and psychology and science and military science, searching for the clues as to new and powerful ways of working. I think a second element is you have to look for clues as to a problem worth solving. I've got a spreadsheet that I've been running for years of great questions. Often the pointer to the unknown. It's a typical question, right? What is it that we don't know well enough and should know more? Almost by definition, we can't describe that isn't described voluminously, perfectly. So you have to look for clues. One of the clues is the questions the client asks. The strange questions, the unanswered questions, the awkward questions, the anxiety-inducing questions. Questions is a good place to start. Phenomena is another one, which is, I read about this thing happening. That seems to not fit into any of the strategy paradigms that I know about. The exploration of anomalies. I think there's serendipity. Many human inventions serendipitously discovered while pursuing something else. The telephone was an attempt to find a better telegraph, not the attempt to find a telephone. The telephone was serendipity. The breadth of reading that I just referred to often points you in the direction of productive serendipity. And then I think there's something to do with time allocation, which is whether it's with your team or with your client, I think being 100% efficient and 100% deployed on the well-conditioned, the well-known part of the problem essentially leaves no space for exploration or imagination. So I do think that slack or unproductive time or exploration time or imagination time or whatever you want to call it is tremendously important. And it's an active battle because I think the professional paradigm, especially in the US, is that essentially you 100% utilized and 100% efficient and 100% focused all of the time, which probably makes you extremely efficient in the short term, but may not be a very good recipe for coming up with new ideas.
Hey, it's Michael here, and we'll be right back to the podcast. But first, are you ready to grow, scale, and take your consulting business and marketing to the next level? If so, our Clarity Coaching program may be a great fit for you. You'll work with our experienced team to set up a strategic plan for your business and coach you step by step in areas like how to consistently attract more leads, develop a magnetic message that resonates with your ideal clients, strategically package and position your services, earn higher fees, win more proposals, and scale your business. To find out more about Clarity Coaching and apply, go to consultingsuccess.com and click on coaching.
I have to ask, Martin, about that spreadsheet that you referred to that you've been doing for years. How many rows deep is it now with full of questions?
I've become more discriminating over time in terms of what counts as a zinger question for me. I've probably got about 100 questions and usually 4 or 5 that I'm actively thinking about, which are just things I hear people ask that I sometimes in another discipline, sometimes in a business situation where I think, wow, that's a really interesting question. I have no idea what the answer is, but I should think some more about that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. I'd love to see that. The power of a question is just amazing. You do spend, as you mentioned, a lot of time now thinking about the future and what things may look like. I'm wondering from the perspective of consultant and probably more the perspective of a solo consultant or a small consulting firm, so not necessarily like the BCGs and others at that level. What do you think is most important for someone running a small boutique consulting firm over the next 5 to 10 years? What are things that people should probably start paying attention to now or start developing their skills or their kind of body of work or to begin studying if we're thinking a little bit more into the future?
I've worked alongside consulting firms, and also I have some opinions about what might be universals across big and small companies. But from my limited perspective, I think tomorrow's problems are rapidly becoming today's problems. And therefore, I think one needs to constantly redefine one's domain. So, for example, 5 years ago, or maybe even less, something like purpose consulting on business purpose, or sustainability consulting might have been future-oriented and niche enough that one could specialize on them, either as an individual consultant or as a small firm. I think there's a sense in which all of the things that we positioned as problems in the future have become today's problem. I think one needs to evolve one's portfolio faster. For example, if you're in the purpose consulting business or in the sustainability consulting business, you probably have to think more frequently of what comes next. What is the edge? What is it that people are not talking about, should be talking about? So in a way, it's bringing competitive discipline to the logic of consulting offering.
I should say, when you and I spoke previously, you brought up the word resilience, noting that down and thinking, okay, when we jump on the podcast, I want to get your take on that word. It's a word that seems to be coming up more in conversations. And I'm wondering how the word resilience and what is the importance of it for a consultant or...
Right. Yeah, I can answer that in a couple of ways. So the direct answer is what I think about resilience. But in a sense, this also illustrates what we've been talking about in terms of where do I choose to focus and how do I choose to focus? So at the beginning of COVID, I've been interested in resilience for some time, and it's always been an interesting conversation to have with CFOs. Interesting, but rarely did it lead to some large or deep consulting assignment. It was more of intellectual interest. And of course, there's some value in that because exploratory conversations can deepen relationships and expand agendas, little direct value. At the beginning of COVID, and looking at all of the changes in the world, I made a bet that this was going to become more mainstream, and therefore I put a lot of emphasis on it. I published a series of pieces in HBR and edited a book on it and wrote another book on it, put fairly large energy into resilience. And why did I do that? I felt that it was a timely topic. It also had the hallmark of the sort of thing which I often pursue, which is something which is acknowledged as important, but is ill-disciplined. It's not clear in the specifics. And I found that a lot of companies were, during the early COVID crisis, were talking about the resilience of their supply chains, the resilience of their strategies. But if you say, well, how do you measure that? What actually is that? What is that not? Which part of that is new relative to the traditional strategy process? Very few companies had the playbook on resilience. They just had intuitions. That was the opportunity, what I call the codification opportunity. And it wasn't the idea of resilience. It wasn't the idea that resilience was important. It was getting into the specifics of what is it? How do you do it? What's different? What's new? How do you measure it? And so on. So my conclusion broadly is that resilience is something that actually I think strategists have been searching for a long time. Michael Porter years ago said we need a dynamic theory of strategy. We don't have one. And so essentially it responds to that. It responds to the limitations of the scale and efficiency school of strategies from the early 60s onwards. For about 20 years, strategy was mainly about relative market share, economies of scale, and economies of learning. And dynamic capabilities are a very different logic. It's about learning faster than your competitors. It was timely from that respect. We actually did something which I couldn't have done when I first joined consulting, which is we analyzed the public data on the response function of companies initially to COVID. And then, of course, we had something else. We had the COVID-induced recession and the COVID-induced recovery. And then we had the Ukraine war. And so actually, I've been getting big data on all public companies on how quickly they coped with and how well they coped with each of those interruptions. We may have another one, a second COVID recession. And I found some really interesting things. So I found out that resilience is much more than crisis management. In other words, resilience in a crisis shapes performance across an entire economic cycle, not just for the period of a crisis. That was one interesting finding. A second interesting finding was that as a strategist, I'm interested in not how well companies did. I'm interested in how well they did relative to their competitors. And I found this sort of Ayrton Senna effect. Ayrton Senna, the racing driver, said if you want to overtake 14 cars, you'll actually have a higher chance of achieving that, providing you're a good driver on a rainy day than under sunny conditions. And that turns out to be quite clearly true from the data, which is that if you want to overtake your competitors, a bad time, a turbulent time is actually much better chance to do that statistically than good times. That was interesting. The majority of the differential effect across a cycle in a crisis and beyond is actually not on the cost or the operational side of things. It's mostly a product of differential growth. So often when we talk about resilience, there's an assumption that we are mitigating downside risk, whereas actually upside differential growth is where most of the differential benefits are. It's all about growing at the times when your competitors would least likely be focused on growth. It's associated with a set of capabilities, primarily 4 types of discipline. So one of them is disciplines of anticipation. The other ones is buffering. The immediate onslaught of a crisis is the point of acute stress. And if your company is going to fail, it will fail relatively quickly. And so there's the value of buffering, the value of the buffering stocks and the cash balances it may be productive to have on hand in the event of a shock. The third one is disciplines of adaptation, which is a crisis is never, in retrospect, we may say, the 2008 crisis was a single blip. But in practice, crises unfold continuously and you never know the full extent until it's over. So with COVID, we thought we knew, and then it turned out that we needed different technology to develop the vaccines. Some strains it was effective against some strains and not others, and certain hygiene disciplines seemed to work and others not to work. It kept unfolding. So it required ongoing adaptation. And then the last one was the topic of my latest book, Imagination, which is in the long run, resilience is actually about the ability not to adjust to circumstances, but to create circumstances, to be the disruption, to be the imagination of a new way of doing things that enables you to thrive under new circumstances. Because crises are rarely cyclical if you look in detail. Usually the pattern of demand changes after the crisis. You're dealing with a different pattern of demand from before the crisis. So that requires imagination to say, how could I do well in this different world after the crisis? Because it's not merely the restoration of previous conditions. So that was the research that I carried out that resulted in the latest book, The Imagination Machine. And I called it The Imagination Machine because on long time frames, the companies are indeed imagination machines. They change the world, probably greater than any visionary or poet or politician, by imagining something which is possible and causing it to be the case by implementing it and scaling it with great discipline. So the question was, how does that work? Because that's a neglected area of strategy. That's another one of these areas where I'm looking at the gap. I'm saying, obviously, imagination is important. Obviously, there's no textbook for it. Obviously, there needs to be. I can codify that. So I looked at all the latest neuroscience. I looked at examples of imaginative companies, ones that had reshaped new domains, and tried to figure out, how do they do that? And I hopefully came up with something that approximates an answer.
So that was going to be one of my questions, is really around your latest book, The Imagination Machine, because it sounds like there's just so much value in being able to harness the power of imagination and bring it into your own organization or the work that you do with clients. If there was maybe just one or two things that you might share from the book around how a consultant might begin that process of harnessing the imagination, just any recommendations you would have for somebody.
Firstly, let me say why this was a slightly strange book and received as a slightly strange book. The reason is that we don't associate large organizations with imagination. In fact, if you're talking to CEO about imagination, mostly they'll talk about the absence of imagination in their organizations. Secondly, we have this image of imagination from the Romantic period in the arts. We think about a poet staring into the clouds or a Steve Jobs staring into the clouds and coming up with some insight that is unexplainable. Where did they come up with that insight? Mere mortals could never replicate that. If you look at the neuroscience of imagination, that turns out to be a fairly arbitrary way of looking at things. And we don't shy away from thinking about other complex aspects of human affairs, right? We don't say, oh my God, personnel management, motivating teams. That's so complicated. We could never possibly hope to codify that. We say, that's worth looking at. We develop methodologies. So I felt that, well, we could develop methodology here. So after sparing you the details of the research, after looking at the neuroscience and the examples of imagination, we figured out that you have to get 6 things right to have a successful cycle of imagination. So my book is not about the act of ideation. It's about the complete cycle from noticing anomalies in the external world, developing ideas, right through to scaling those ideas and then coming up with new ideas to disrupt the old ideas. So it's a cycle of imagination. And the 6 things that one needs to get right, I think the first thing is one needs to be seduced by an anomaly. So big companies look at averages. They don't look at the specifics of an unusual customer transaction that may give a hint to a better way of doing things. But imaginative companies do. They think like novelists, not like accountants. They look at the particular detail. They're very focused on anomalies. And if you like a minute, I can give you a very spectacular example of a company that was very driven to understand anomalies. The next one is framing or extracting the idea. So you have to ask this question that we discussed earlier, which is, okay, that's the anomaly, but what is that an example of? What could that mean? How do I frame that anomaly? And how do I flesh out what that could be in terms of a business opportunity? A 5-year-old can do that. These are the skills of counterfactual thinking, of imagination. Actually, as far as I can tell, this is not part of any regular secondary education curriculum, university education curriculum, MBA curriculum. Imaginative companies train their people on counterfactual thinking. The average company comes with a more analytical skill set and struggles with counterfactual thinking. The third thing is what I call the collision, which is colliding ideas with reality. I don't say validation because one of the things that's happened when you collide an idea with the real world is you validate, did it work? But of course, most new ideas fail. The more persistent and more regular value in that collision, it's a constant mode of exploration and a way of generating new surprises. The neuroscience of imagination is all based on surprise, on anomaly. So you generate more anomalies, which deepen your understanding of what could be. The fourth stage is the Achilles heel of most large companies, which is the spread of ideas. An idea is like a virus. If it spreads, the idea is successful. It's in 2 ways. It's adopted, and secondly, it evolves as it goes through different types of mind. The functional silos of organizations and their territorial jealousies and their metrics and their special language is a great way of making sure that ideas don't propagate in companies. The 5th stage may not sound like imagination at all, but it requires a very special type of imagination, which is industrializing ideas. If you think about being the Four Seasons Hotel with its legendary customer service, and you were opening a branch in Shanghai with Chinese employees, how would you communicate how to replicate that successful customer service? You probably wouldn't send them the 1,000-page manual because that may not be that useful. People would just be confused. And you probably wouldn't just slap them on the back and say, it's all about the customer, do your best, and because that's too vague. So the codification of the replication, the system of replication and scaling is very important. And then lastly, self-disruption. It's very hard to turn around the successful company, but all of our evidence is another thing I've spent a lot of time looking at, says the most effective way of avoiding being disrupted is to disrupt yourself. And the earlier you do it, the better. So you have to get those 6 things. Would you like me to give you an example of bring one? I don't think we have time to bring all of those to light. Should I try and bring the anomaly detection to light?
That'd be great. Let's do that one and then we'll wrap up. This is wonderful.
One example we deal with in the book, thank you to the openness of the company involved, was in semiconductor equipment manufacture. So the semiconductor manufacturer involves very specialized equipment that is aseptic. It's never a hair or a piece of dust in the silicon because you'll ruin the wafers, and automated handling and handling at a vacuum under temperature control conditions, all of that. A company called Brooks Automation, based in the northeast of America, a leading company in this area in semiconductor manufacturing equipment manufacturing, very successful company in that area, decides that they're doing pretty well, but they want to see the next wave of growth. And at some point, their current successful recipe is probably going to plateau. So they're looking for the next thing. And they decide that an exercise in spotting anomalies. So they wanted to be surprised, basically. And they created, one of the things they did to create surprises, they created their second order patent network. In other words, they looked at who's using our patents and who's quoting the patents of the companies that are using our patents. And most of that space, most of that network was extremely unsurprising. For example, guess what? Electronics manufacturers were looking at better ways of making aseptic conditions for the semiconductor manufacturer. Not surprising at all. But they were interested in only the surprising part. And they found a surprise, which is that the bioscience industry was playing with its technologies. And they thought, we've no idea why that's the case. That was a surprise. So they decided to go out and do some anthropology, figure out what's going on. And what they found was that the materials handling in the bioscience industry, bioscience laboratories, was absolutely abysmal relative to the standards of the semiconductor manufacturing industry. You had tissue samples in Tupperware containers, in laboratory fridges, hand-labeled, and it was all very manual, not at all aseptic, very inefficient, very error-prone. And that was stage 1 of my framework, the anomaly detection, and then they went into stage 2, the question, what could this possibly mean? And they convinced themselves that actually this could mean the birth of an entire new industry, which they called the biobanking industry or the biological materials handling industry. They made an acquisition to get closer to that space. Essentially, they needed distribution and relationships in the space. They developed a position in the space. It was successful. It was so successful, it became their new core business. And so successful that actually they exited their previous core business, and now this is their business. Of course, the example is the simplification. There are all sorts of other things going on, but to me, it's a very good example of the power of surprise, imagination, seeking anomalies, asking this question, what is this an example of? You're actually imagining the consequences of exploiting the anomaly, and it's a very successful business build around this very entrepreneurial question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Martin, I really want to thank you for coming on here today and sharing so much, just so many thought-provoking ideas. I think people will find this to be incredibly valuable. I want to encourage everyone to go out and get your most recent book, The Imagination Machine, also your previous books, because you've written several of them. Where would be the best place for people to go to learn more about your books, about your work, and everything else you have going on right now?
So we have a website for the Institute, the BCG Henderson Institute. So it's BCG Henderson Institute. I always get confused as to whether it's .com or .org. If you try both, one will take you to a site of a sort of a children's play school, and the other one will take you to the Henderson Institute, but bcghendersoninstitute.com.
Yeah, bchendersoninstitute.com.
And you'll see the complete portfolio of our work there. So many of topics that we haven't spent time thinking about, or talking about today. For example, the intersection of politics and strategy. That's a recent area of activity. The book itself has its own website, theimaginationmachine.org. And you'll find some interesting artifacts there, and some articles, and actually an online art gallery of acts of imagination from corporations that shape the world. We think that these first sketches of an idea that changed the world, like the first sketch of the telephone and so on, they're rather beautiful in their own way. So we created an online art gallery called the Napkin Gallery, after the apocryphal napkin that people draw their inventors are said to draw their first sketches on it, and they often do, and we collected those napkins. Or, of course, you can go out and buy the books. The two I had the most recent two, which I think pertain to today's discussion. One is The Imagination Machine, and the other one is Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, both from Harvard Business Press.
We're going to link that up in the show notes. Martin, again, thanks so much for coming on.
And thanks for great questions. The great thing about the consulting industry, you're always learning. You may have 30 or 50 years of experience, but these questions are always very fresh and the art is infinite, right? For you and I to crack that out, for any consultant to crack this out completely, it will never happen. We're all perpetually learning.
Indeed. No, I really enjoyed the conversation. Again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. For more episodes and to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, head on over to iTunes. And if you'd like to develop consistent lead flow and a highly profitable consulting business, learn more about our coaching programs at consultingsuccess.com.